The fourth door. Decades of despair ago, when I was 30-something, Ratso, my cat, would stretch his black body into an arch at the end of my bed, then meow me to my feet to feed him. Without Ratso, I'd be stuck in bed for days, wrapped in fetal paralysis, obsessing about the three doors. Behind the first two, I saw two different, indifferent men, each in his own way, unable to love me. Behind the third, only a mirror image of myself, terrified to be alone. There was no way out of this misery until I called you. Do you remember those early morning calls? Just two hysterical young women at 8:30 in the morning. Me, underemployed and anxious about love. You, downtown at your day job desk, dreaming of courtlier times, waiting for your boss to arrive and wag his tail, all eager for another lascivious day at the office without his wedding ring. Do you remember picking up the phone and listening to my dilemma of doors? Do you remember saving me with words that traveled through telephone wires, strung out from pole to pole between us in the sad walked city of our youth before cell phones? Remember the fourth door, you said. Behind it, someone very special is waiting for you to open it. Do you remember how I begged you to write that down immediately? Send it in a letter, the kind we sent back then on paper, in envelopes, licked, stamped, and posted for safekeeping? I so wanted to keep and hold on to the promise of those words. And now, 40 years later, long since we both opened our fourth doors and found true love, both of us wake on opposite coasts with lasting love and cats that cry on our morning beds as we shudder to remember the friends and family already lost. Today, knowing what I know, I don't call, but instant message instead. I message you courage, without a phone of any kind. Can you receive it? As you wake to care for your beloved husband, and inpatient now with privileges for visiting home. There are so many miles between us as you rise to face the door you least expected to open, the one where your brilliant professor now stands, stooped by his stroke, lost on the threshold, stunned as dementia fills the frame.
Drunk in Nicaragua. By the time I learned my grandfather was an alcoholic, he had 23 years sober. My 12-year-old brain couldn't believe it. The patient, even-tempered guy I played cards with, who quoted Honeymooners bits, who took me for summer afternoon drives in the old Pontiac. My mother wouldn't reveal much, only that my grandfather had been a quiet drunk who drank alone at night. I wanted to know more, so I waited for the right moment to get the straight story. An afternoon when my sister and grandmother were off doing something, when it was just my grandfather and me sitting at his kitchen table eating lunch. My grandfather shook his head and said, "No, I don't like to talk about my drinking days." He leaned forward, lowering his big head until his blue eyes were even with mine. "But I will tell you about getting sober." He sat up, had a bite of his sandwich and a sip of his coffee, and said, "Friends of Bill Wilson, AA." There were a few meetings around, but I usually went to one in the basement of St. Matthew's, over on Oak Avenue. We had a lot of regulars from the neighborhood, We were a good group, not too big. One night we got a first-timer, a woman, early 30s I'd say. She shuffled in a few minutes before the meeting started. No eye contact. And as she sat down, she muttered this weak hello. I understood. I'd been there myself. She had this thick head of black curly hair, messy, knotted in places, and her clothes were rumpled, like she'd been sleeping in them, and much too big. She held her mouth tight, clenched her jaw a lot. The meeting starts, and this woman's eyes are on her lap. She's there, but somewhere else too. Now, at meetings, there's often a time when the floor is open for sharing. So it comes around, and after a few of us say what's on our minds, the new woman volunteers to speak. She introduces herself, and well, she stays slouched in her seat, weak shoulders, her eyes don't move from her lap. She's sitting only a few feet from me, but I have to strain to hear her. She says she's been sober for 2-3 days. She wants to drink so bad, but she knows she can't, and she swears up and down she really wants to stop drinking, and her brother told her about the meeting, and here she is. She tells us she started drinking in high school, spent college drunk, but no problem, she graduated with flying colors. My grandfather took a deep breath, lifted his coffee cup, and put it right down without drinking. He adjusted himself in his chair, getting tall. She tells us she was working in Managua, the capital of Nicaragua, some kind of job at a consulate. She straightens herself, squares her shoulders, looks up at us, eyes bright, and tells us how good life was. The job was easy, the pay was real nice. She starts talking with her hands, smiling too, speaking with a strong voice. She tells us how often she and her coworkers went out drinking, how everyone did it. Sometimes they were still drunk when they showed up at work the next morning. No one cared. She went on and on about all the fun she had getting drunk in Nicaragua, the time of her life, all the parties, all the men, on and on, drunk in Nicaragua. Then she's getting transferred back to DC, getting fired, and moving back to Connecticut, living with her brother. Couldn't understand what happened. She sighed and sort of slouched back down into her chair. I wasn't surprised. Sharing it 2 days, tough to find words, exhausting. The meeting moved on, but she spaced out. As soon as we were done, she was up, making a beeline for the door, and was gone. I never saw her again. I shouldn't judge, but I bet you she didn't last 2 more days. My grandfather finished off his sandwich and took a final swig of his coffee. Then he told me to clear the table and get the new deck of cards from his desk in the den. I remember thinking, hold on, we're done? I had so many questions, like what happened to hearing about getting sober? But I did what I was told, thinking maybe there was more. Maybe my grandfather was making me wait. He often enjoyed doling out a tale. So I waited through the card game and a couple of episodes of The Twilight Zone and a few rounds of 20 questions. I stayed patient, but there was no rest of the story. So I put it away until years later, a decade after my grandfather had died, when my own life showed me it was time to think about the woman who got drunk in Nicaragua.